distinguished professors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Today, Student Festival Juvenalia started at Polish universities. Classes and exams are cancelled, and students can enjoy concerts and games at the main hall and the main campus of our university. Thank you so much for coming, because we strongly believe that the most important event today is about to start here, in this room.
Thank you so much for coming. My name is Maksymilian Piekut, and together with my colleague, Paulina Uznańska, we represent Polish Research Center for Law and Economy of China. We have the pleasure of hosting today's seminar entitled New Silk Road, Perspectives from the East to the West. Now, we would like to give the floor to Professor Maciej Duszczyk, Vice Rector for Research and International Relations at the University of Warsaw, to welcome all distinguished guests and officially open the seminar. Professor Duszczyk, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. So, dear Professor Mark C. Elliott, dear Professor Matthew Fashion, dear Professor Andrew Godwin, dear Professor Andrew Lin, and dear Ambassador Chomicki, it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you. All distinguished guests, it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you. The University of Warsaw, on the occasion of this seminar under the title, The New Silk Road, Perspectives from the East to the West. As Paulina mentioned, it is the special time for us because this is Juvenalia, this is the student festival. That's why, again, thank you very much for your coming to this building. This building is there, as you probably know, but I think so. It might be the new information for our international guests. This is the part of the University of Warsaw Library. We have the absolutely fantastic garden on the roof. And then, if you find time after the seminar, I really strongly recommend to visit for the 10 minutes this roof, because this is an amazing place, must to see in Warsaw. I think so. That's why it is. I think so. Also, the great opportunity to visit this place. I think so. That's at the University of Warsaw. We have 2 or 3 very important and very strong centers for different Chinese studies. One of them is the Center for Chinese Economy and Law, who is the organizer today's seminar, but also this organizer, the School of Law and Economy of China. But we have also a very strong faculty of Oriental Study, and the part of this faculty is our Sinology, Department of Sinology, and I would like to welcome also Dr. Religa, the director of this department, of this unit. Of course, our connections, our relations with China, with different Chinese universities are very important for us, as I think so, as for all universities over the world. I came back 2 weeks ago. I spent 1 week, two weeks ago, in Taiwan to strengthen our cooperation with different Taiwanese universities, also the National Taiwan University. But next week, I have the visit from the Vice Rector for International Relations from Sichuan University in Chengdu, and I will go to China in the first week of June. It means that our relations with Chinese, with the universities from mainland China and with universities from Taiwan are very, very strong. And new Silk Road perspectives from the east to the west. I think so. All of us, we are waiting now to improve our knowledge about the New Silk Road, One Belt, One Road initiative, and the consequences for such regions like Central Europe, but not only, of course, from different perspectives, for different regions worldwide. But I think so. It is really, really important to improve our knowledge about the different perspectives from the West and from the East. I know very well that you are not here in this room during this beautiful weather for my speech. You are waiting for other speeches. That's why thank you very much for your coming again, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Duszczyk, for your welcoming remarks. And now it's time for Dr. Piotr Grzebyk, Head of Polish Research Center for Law and Economy of China.
Thank you, Paulina. Welcome one and all to the seminar, to the first open seminar, which is jointly co-organized by 4 institutions, as you see on our slides. Harvard Club of Poland. I think Professor Mai will explain what kind of an institution is that. Polish Research Center for Law and Economy is a part of the Faculty of Law. Our ambition is to write reports, to do scientific research on modern day China. So we would like to accommodate with a team of young researchers associated with within the law faculty. We would like to do research on China. With this knowledge, we would like to share also with this knowledge. That's why we established last year School of Law and Economy. That's why part of the audience is our students. For them, this seminar is obligatory. Yeah? They need to attend and listen our experts. In fact, we had the pleasure to have classes this afternoon with Professor Godwin. If you don't mind, I would like to welcome once again Professor Religa, who is in charge of the Sinology Department of the University of Warsaw, and former Ambassador Ksawery Burski, who was a Polish ambassador to China. So we know that starting from 2013, when Xi Jinping officially declared that China will kick off with the One Belt, One Road initiative, we as a people from academia, we faced a real tsunami of papers, reports, what is going to be with the New Silk Road. And even when I was in China last weeks, when we entered a bookstore in Wanfujin Street, we noticed that there is a special bookshelf only for books dealing with the One Belt, One Road. I even found a book written in Polish I couldn't get in Poland about One Belt, One Road. So we know, at least we try within the center to follow up what is going on, what is discussion in China about One Belt, One Road. One Belt, One Road is a subject of heated debate also in Poland. That's why today the idea of the panel is we don't have experts from Poland here. We don't have an expert from Made in China, because we would like to listen what experts from overseas, from abroad, will what they think about the One Belt, One Road, maybe what they think, what is the role of Poland in this project. So I wish you fruitful discussion. Welcome you once again.
Thank you, Dr. Grzebyk. Now we would like to give the floor to Dr. Waldemar Maj, President of Harvard Club of Poland.
Thank you for introducing me. First, a small correction. I'm not a professor. I'm just PhD in physics. My mother was very unhappy when I dropped physics and went to Harvard Business School 25 years ago, so for the second master degree. Well, Harvard Club of Poland is an association that gathers all the alumni of Harvard University in Poland. And we organize events, which the flagship event is there on the roll-up called Path to Harvard, also open for students who can compete for awards and go to Harvard and learn how to get to Harvard, actually. So I'd like to welcome you all, guests and the panelists, at this remarkable seminar. Especially I would like to welcome Professor Elliott from Harvard University, which we host here in Poland, not the first time. 2 years ago, we had the pleasure to host him at our club when we discussed the higher education, the future of higher education with him. So not prolonging this again, thank you very much for inviting us, and we co-sponsored the event, and well, I wish you a fruitful discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mai. And now we will move to the most important part of today's seminar, keynote speech and presentations. Both socioeconomic and legal part will be moderated by Ambassador Tadeusz Chomicki. Ambassador Tadeusz Chomicki is a former staff member of the University of Warsaw and also a professional diplomat. Mr. Chomicki is a former ambassador of Poland to South Korea, China, and Mongolia. Currently, he is active in the field of security policy. He is also a Ministry of Foreign Affairs advisor to the Polish-Chinese Parliamentary Group and chairman of Program Council of the Polish-Chinese Education Foundation. Ambassador Chomicki was a visiting professor at 5 Chinese universities, and he's also a honorary citizen of Harbin, Chengdu, and Seoul. Ambassador Chomicki, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paulina. Thank you very much. I am pleased, as the former university teacher, I'm pleased to see a lot of young people here who are not taking part in the Juvenalia Students' Festival currently going on, with a very attractive program including popular rock groups and dancing and Myslovic, etc., as I know today. So I'm pleased to see you all here, but I'm not surprised on the other hand, because we have not only the vice rector of your university, which is always important to see, but the 4 prominent professors who really know what they're going to talk about. One comment I need to make, that as Paulina introduced, the important part of my short CV she presented is the last one, the very last one, the Polish-Chinese Education Foundation. And I'm speaking here in this responsibility, not as the foreign ministry, and that is important to remember. The first speaker, the keynote speaker, is Professor Mark Elliott. And there's a good message for all you young people here. Professor Elliott, before he became a star, he was also a student. He also even was a BA himself. He graduated from Yale University in 1981, of course summa cum laude, and he became a Master of Arts in 1984 there. He earned his PhD in history at the University of California, Berkeley, and he taught at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the University of Michigan before coming to Harvard in 2003. And be careful with his comments about him, because he speaks and understands Polish. Professor Elliott is a Vice Provost of International Affairs at Harvard University, and he's also a Mark Schwartz Professor of Chinese and Inner Asian History in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations, and in the Department of History and Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Professor Elliott is an authority of the last 4 centuries of the Chinese history, in particular the Qing period, but his research encompasses the history of relations between China and nomadic frontier, with a special attention to questions of ethnicity and empire. His first book, The Manchu Way, Date Banners and Ethnic Identity in Late Imperial China, is a pioneering study in the new Qing history, an approach emphasizing the imprint of Inner Asian traditions upon China's last imperial state. He's also author of Emperor Qianlong, Son of Heaven, Man of the Word, and has published more than 25 scholarly articles. He serves on numerous editorial boards. He was for 3 years the director of Fairbanks Center of Chinese Studies. And he is ready to share with you his thoughts on the Belt and Road Initiative, which you certainly should listen to with a great attention. Professor, the floor is yours.
Ambassador Chomicki, thank you very much for that introduction. I chciałem też powiedzieć dzień dobry. Dziękuję serdecznie za zaproszenie. Bardzo się cieszę, naprawdę bardzo się cieszę, mogąc dać wykład na Uniwersytecie Warszawskim. Moja żona tu studiowała i pracowała i zaproszenie Wydziału Prawa i Administracji. To dla mnie naprawdę wielki zaszczyt. Chciałbym szczególnie podziękować panu profesorowi Piotrowi Krybykowi i kolegom z centrum. Chciałbym też podziękować Harvard Club of Poland i dr Mike, który tu jest obecny, za sponsorowanie dzisiejszej konferencji. Dziękuję wszystkim dzisiaj, którzy przyjechali. So thank you very much again. I'm delighted to be here with such a distinguished panel to share some thoughts with you that I hope will provide a very broad context for understanding the Belt and Road Initiative and how it fits into a couple of different kinds of historical narratives, some of them close to the narrative that the government would like everybody to think in, and others perhaps not so close to what the Chinese government would like us to see things through. And in front of such a distinguished audience with two former ambassadors, the head of Sinologia at UVU, it really is a rare privilege. So let me just jump in here. Let's see here. I think, Paulina, we have a little issue with the... Okay, yeah. So the Belt and Road Initiative, and I will be very brief in this introductory part because we have experts here who know much more than I about this. One Belt, One Road is what it used to be called. Belt and Road Initiative is the new name. The original terminology comes from a couple of different expressions, 新丝路经济带 and 新海上丝路. And it's the Dai from the belt, economic belt, and the Lu from the new maritime Silk Road that gives us one belt, one road. Now, in the beginning, the English name for Idai Ilu was literally one belt, one road for the first 3 years or so. And then the English language name for the initiative changed and became known as the Belt and Road Initiative. Perhaps one of my colleagues here will know the answer as to why it was changed. I've not seen any explanation except that perhaps writing O-B-O-R, OBOR, didn't sound very good to some people, and BRI maybe sounded a little bit better. Let me just point out that the Chinese name has never changed. The Chinese name has consistently been Idai Ilu everywhere you look. And as we have heard, you will find now references to the BRI, to Idai Ilu, everywhere. Everywhere you go. Every airport, every bookstore, every university. There are think tanks, institutes, journals. There's a whole knowledge infrastructure and semi-commercial infrastructure, obviously, that has been built around selling the Belt and Road Initiative, not to mention the things that the Belt and Road Initiative is building in many places around the world. 81 countries so far. The idea is to spend about $1 trillion over 10 years. I'm going to go through these maps quickly because you'll see more detail in later lectures. It covers pretty much all of Asia, Africa, and Europe, including Poland. There is a lot of emphasis on railroads, on bridges, tunnels, dams, airports, and the like, ports, what have you, spanning the entire continent. Here's another map showing the various kinds of projects over land and on the sea. It's expanded. You can see here the rough amounts. These are out of date. We'll get more up-to-date figures, I'm sure, in a little while. But it is also now included to expand Latin America. Now, I think we can make a reasonable historical case for the eastern coast of Africa having been part of some larger trade network in the pre-modern period. But to stretch it to Latin America certainly is asking a lot, I think, at least of a historian, unless one wants to consider the fact that half the silver that was mined in the New World ended up in China. But that is a story, that has, I think, little to do with the Silk Road and everything to do with early modern economics that really gets started in the 15th, 16th centuries. There's a lot of finance associated with the Belt and Road Initiative, and with that has come criticism. We'll hear more about this, that some of these loans are perhaps not advantageous to the countries taking the loans, and so this has led in some places to talk of a new colonial kind of structure being put in place as within the Belt and Road. This is an article in the New York Times from a couple of years ago, less than a year ago now, similar sort of take on BRI in The Guardian. Perhaps, again, those who will be following me will have more to say about this particular aspect, an aspect I should mention that is pretty thoroughly denied in China. And from the Chinese side, the emphasis is pretty exclusively upon the economic benefits that are to be brought by the Belt and Road Initiative. And when asked, as I have asked, the high-level officials, what about the political dimensions of the Belt and Road? I'm told that there are no political dimensions to the Belt and Road in any of the countries in which infrastructure is being built. So that is the formal position. Returning then to the One Belt, One Road, you'll notice in the names that it's, if you read Chinese, how many here can, just have a show of hands, how many here can read Chinese? Oh, that's a great number. Well done, Sinologia. It didn't used to be that there were so many students studying Chinese at the university. I remember from the 1990s, the numbers were much smaller. So obviously, things have gone in an excellent direction. That's wonderful to see. So who can tell me what the first character is and what it means? Xin, what does Xin mean? New, right? So this is emphasis on the new. It's a new Silk Road. It's a new maritime Silk Route. It's a new economic belt. New meaning that there must have been something that preceded it, right? So here we have newspaper headlines on the new Silk Road and a new dream. The new dream part, the Xin Mengxiang, this has kind of been forgotten. This is an early headline from 2014. Don't see a lot of connections between the Zhongguo Meng and the Yidailu, although sometimes it's there. Here again, the new Silk Road. So what was the old Silk Road? The idea that there's a new Silk Road is predicated upon the notion that there must have been something before it, and this is simply a restoration. This is an attempt to revive old trade networks and to bring back into being the connections between China and its neighbors around the world, even in Latin America, with whom it formerly had trade connections, but those connections having withered, now needing to be revived. So what I'd like to do in the time that I have is to explore a little bit about what this old Silk Road in fact was, who came up with the idea of the Silk Road in the first place, and then at the very end to explore a little bit about the connections between this historic Silk Road, to the extent that we can know anything about it, and the Belt and Road Initiative, which is based upon the presumed existence of an old Silk Road. So this story starts actually not such a long time ago. Story of the Silk Road, where the idea of the Silk Road came from, really goes back only to the 19th century. The Silk Road, as some of you will certainly know, is a Western invention. You can look in any number of Chinese texts from before 1950, you will find no mention of anything called the Silk Road. It doesn't exist. The name doesn't exist. The idea of the Silk Road, the idea of ancient trade routes linking China with Central Asia and Western Asia, and ultimately, say, Europe and the Middle East, was the brainchild of a German geographer, Ferdinand von Richthofen, shown here. And we can date pretty precisely when the idea first arose. It arose in an article he published in 1877 in a German geographical journal, the Transactions of the Geographical Society of Berlin, Behandlungsgesellschaft der Erdkunde zu Berlin. I don't know if there are any subscribers to this important journal anymore today. But you can find it in the library, and you look it up, and there we find Professor von Richthofen's musings on the Central Asian Silk Roads up to the 2nd century CE. This is the first time that anybody proposed the idea of these ancient routes in any systematic way. It is the first appearance of the term Silk Road, in this case, Seidenstraßen being, of course, in the plural in any language. So 1877 is a date to remember in the history of the Silk Road. And when you read von Richthofen's article, you will find that he is proceeding primarily from geographic information that he has. He's a geographer. He has familiarized himself with different geographic and geologic forms in the region. And based upon what he saw in terms of landforms and what he expected that those landforms would mean for the movement of people and the movement of goods, he came up with the notion that there must have been these trade routes in these certain places. He identified the likely routes where people would have moved and where goods would have moved with them. And then, on the basis primarily of classical texts from Greece and Rome, especially Roman texts, Roman-era texts, and a few bits of translated sources from Chinese that had been put into European languages by the 19th century, he found just enough evidence in these texts to lend some credence, to put a little meat on the bones of the idea that people were moving back and forth in these places. So just a few quotations here to run past you. Here you can see him referring to the geographic formations, the undulations, and the wide stretches of steppes and desert that characterize this part of Asia, and people, tribes migrated along these areas connecting China with India as well as with Central Asia. People followed where it was easiest for them to go, and they were able then to get to more fertile regions, and they were also able to bring goods with them to travel. And here he gets to the trade part. Trade goes where people can move more easily. There were trade centers, and with trade, of course, came power, political power. So he is also hinting at a political history to be written around movement on the Silk Road, as well as a commercial history. And then he came up with the idea that silk was the most important thing that moved on the Silk Road. Hence the name Silk Road. He derived this, or deduced this, from the notion, I think, that silk was, at this time, a monopoly in China. China was the only place in the world in ancient times where silk was produced, because it was prized highly. We know that from writings of different Roman authors, that silk, in fact, caused quite a lot of controversy. On a day like today, Juvenalia, young women in Rome would have been dressed in silk, and not very heavy silk at that. And that scandalized some of the citizens of Rome who didn't think that sheer gowns of silk were suitable to young ladies to wear. But we know that silk was very popular, and von Richthofen estimated on this basis that it must have been silk that was most commonly traded, and therefore he named it the Silk Road. And he came up with a date when the Silk Road was opened, and he linked this to a military campaign, in fact, that the Han Emperor, Wu Di, launched in the late 2nd century CE, whereby direct connections between China, the Chinese Empire, that is to say the Han Empire, and Central Asia were first established. So the direct silk trade, there seems to be evidence that some silk moved before this, but direct trade really starts in the Han, and this was his historical dating for the beginning of the Silk Road. So we might date a discourse on the Silk Road as having begun in 1877. Von Richthofen dated the Silk Road back to around 120 or so before the Common Era. And he focused particularly on the role played by the Han-era ambassador, Zhang Qian, who was sent to the West to try and create alliances for the Han that would enable them to defeat their nomadic enemy, the Xiongnu. No alliance was established. Jiang Qian missed his main purpose. He did come back with horses, but not with any political alliance. But he did bring silk with him, and the idea is that the silk that Jiang Qian brought alerted people to the fact that there was this wonderful fabric, very valuable, cool in the summer, warm in the winter, lasts forever, is beautiful, you can do all kinds of things with it. And so there was a demand created, and trade began to boom. As he writes here, the empire and the emperor recognized the advantages which might arise from direct trade for China. Remember that this is being written in the middle 19th century, when all Europeans can think about when they thought about China was trade. So he himself was very much a creature of his day. We can be pretty sure that Han Wudi had no interest in free trade. He was not a mercantilist. And that this is, in fact, von Richthofen's reading back into the record. There's really not a lot of evidence to show that Wudi had a plan, as von Richthofen hypothesized, to bring about direct trade. Nonetheless, this was von Richthofen's persuasion. A word then about this conflict that von Richthofen was referring to. This was a long-standing contest between the sedentary peoples of China, China proper, farmers for the most part, at this point unified under rule of the Han state, and then the Xiongnu, who were a nomadic people, who were nomads living on the steppes north of China, and their relations were characterized for about 100 years by the paying of tribute by the Chinese to the Xiongnu. And Han Wudi decided that this was not an arrangement that he was happy with, and he wanted to change things around so that the Xiongnu would be subservient to him. For that, he needed a large army, and he also needed to get an alliance. So his hope was to send, here's the Han, the Xiongnu control most of the steppe. He sent Jiang Qian all the way through Xiongnu territory here to the Fergana Valley, where the hope was to get people called the Yuezhi, later known as the Hephthalites, to join with the Han in a common war against the Xiongnu. The Yuezhi had been driven, the Yuezhi originally had been here. They had been driven to the southwest by the Xiongnu. They were a common enemy. And the Han Emperor was hoping to get a political alliance here, joint against the Xiongnu, attacking from both directions. He needed an alliance, he needed horses. He didn't get an alliance, but he did get horses. And this is a famous statue of the Han-era general Huo Qubing, who died very young on campaign. If you look, it's kind of hard to see in this image, but in this image, you can see a Xiongnu warrior being trampled by one of the horses that the Han had acquired from the Yuezhi. The horses from the Fergana Valley were known to be much larger, faster, stronger than the ponies that were used by the Mongolian cavalry. And this gave the Han, in fact, quite a distinct military advantage against the Xiongnu. And so what happened then is that we have Jiang Qian going out. Here is a mural from a cave in Dunhuang. I'll get back to Dunhuang in a minute. It took him 13 years. He was captured both going and coming. He spent a lot of years with the Xiongnu before they let him go. Here's a later recreation of Jiang Qian as a national hero going out to the west. And what happens is that the Xiongnu, in fact, are defeated, and the Han Empire expands westward into what is now the northern part of Xinjiang and a little bit further into eastern Kazakhstan. Here is another slide showing again the expansion, which lasted for about 100 years or so, a little bit more, with direct Han control before the Han shrink back into China proper and keep the Gansu corridor. And it's at this time that von Richthofen proposed that the routes that had been opened up by the Jiangqian visit and the expansion of Han military power into this part of the world created the impetus then for silk to begin moving on these routes, both through the south and then over maritime routes and also overland to Rome. And hence we get all the maps. Actually, there are no maps included in von Richthofen's original article. He didn't think to include them, but this is what many maps of the Silk Road will look like. They go south of the Taklamakan Desert, Tarim Basin, some go north. One of von Richthofen's hypotheses was that there must have been trade cities on the southern route. Nobody knew about them at the time, but he guessed that they must have been there. And he was right. He was right about that. The work that gave some historical credence to his theories was undertaken by a number of remarkable men in the later 19th and especially in the early 20th century. The first of them was a Swedish explorer, Sven Hedin, who was a student of von Richthofen's, wasn't really a trained archaeologist, but was a real adventurer and nearly died, actually, trying to cross the Taklamakan Desert with his men, barely survived. It was Hedin who was the first one to come upon ruins of these lost cities that had once existed on the edges of the desert in what's now Western China. He was succeeded a little later by a remarkable scholar and archaeologist, Aurel Stein, originally Hungarian. And Stein traveled a lot of the places that Hedin had been. He went with a camera. Hedin didn't have a camera, and so Stein was able to document much more thoroughly the things that he had seen and the places that he had been. Here he is in 1900. You'll see he's with his dog here. Dash. There were 3 or 4 dashes. Stein always traveled with the dog. He was buried with his dog. He's actually buried in Kabul. If you ever get the chance to go to Afghanistan, you will find his tomb there. Here's a photograph that Stein took in 1901 showing that in the sand, in the barren desert, there had in fact been settlements. And at this point, we begin to get some archaeological evidence that people had once lived here, that there had been some kind of trade, and that von Richthofen, in fact, was right, at least in part. One of the most exciting sites on the Silk Road that was opened up in the first part of the 20th century was at the Mogao Caves in Dunhuang, which people had kind of known about, but Stein showed up in 1907, began to look around. He found many examples of beautiful paintings, scrolls, texts of various sorts, which he bought and shipped back. Many are now in London. Others are in Delhi. He was succeeded by the Frenchman Paul Pelliot, who, unlike Stein, could read Chinese and had a much better training in sinology than did Stein. Stein was really more at home in Persian. And so Pelliot also collected, you can see here, there was a special walled-off cave. The whole story of Dunhuang is fascinating, but we don't really have time for that today. Many of these materials are now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Others ended up in St. Petersburg, in Tokyo, in Seoul, and many are also still in Dunhuang, although most have been taken away. And here's an example of the kind of thing that people found. And on this basis, we know that people were using silk. They were using a lot of silk. They were painting on silk, for sure. We also know that music was moving along on the Silk Road. Different kinds of scripts were moving along as people moved from east to west and west to east. The scripts that are used to write Mongolian and Manchu, in fact, were scripts that came on the Silk Road. They originated in the Mediterranean, Syriac scripts that became Sogdian scripts, that became Uyghur scripts, that became Mongolian scripts, and then finally Manchu scripts. So there is definitely a lot of movement on the Silk Road. The question is, how much silk really moved on the Silk Road? I'm going to plant that question in your heads right now. So we have von Richthofen, 1877. He has a theory about ancient trade routes. His students and others follow up, exploring, doing archaeology, publishing, both scholarly and popular books about the Silk Road. And the idea of the Silk Road begins to gain some currency, both academic, scholarly currency, historical validity, as well as popular. I'm going to focus on the popular for a moment. I'll come back to the academic in just a second. So Hedin, who probably was one of the most famous men in the world in the first half of the 20th century, and if he hadn't been such a fervent supporter of the Nazi Party, would probably still be famous today. But he wrote a lot, he traveled a lot, he lectured a lot. He published this book in 1936. It's still in print. This is one of the first books that really tells the story of the Silk Road. It's really his story. He loved to tell about his adventures, and it made a great impression on audiences everywhere and helped to convince people that there was this thing called the Silk Road. Note, please, the camels. I will come back to the camels in a second. We don't get a lot of other things written about the Silk Road. There isn't a lot of literature on this topic. After Pelliot and Stein, there was also a Harvard expedition on the Silk Road in the mid-1920s. But that exploration really disappears after about 1930. Various reasons, foreign explorers are no longer able to easily maneuver in this part of the world, and the Chinese scholars have yet to take much of an interest in this faraway place. And of course, we have the Japanese invasion of China. We have a major war. We have a civil war. New China starts, and the Silk Road kind of goes away for 40 years or so. And it's brought back by Westerners again. And one of the very earliest books to kind of pick up the story of these adventurers, these Hedin and Stein and Pelliot and von Lecoq. There were Germans there were Russians, there were Japanese, Count Otani, everybody was there. Like I said, Harvard was there too. And this book by Peter Hopkirk, a journalist, Foreign Devils on the Silk Road, tells these stories in a very appealing way. This was a pretty popular book. The very same year that this appears, there was a television show, television documentary, the first co-production between the Japanese NHK, the National Television Company in Japan, and the national TV, CCTV, in China. And this was a huge hit. This documentary there was the Silk Road, and there was the continuation of it. There was another continuation of it all the way through into the early 2000s. The audiences, both in Japan and in China, of course, in China in the early 1980s, nobody had a television, so people would have to watch these where they could. Only later did they become better known. The music that went with the Silk Road, the music written by a Japanese electronic composer called Kitaro, Shidolang in Chinese, was a smash hit across all of Asia, all of East Asia in the early 1980s. And when I was a student in Taiwan for the first time, well, I won't say how many years ago, Andrew, but it was you were probably a baby, actually, then. Pirated Kitaro tapes were for sale in all the night markets. And this was my first introduction, in fact, to this romance of the Silk Road and to some of the documentaries. This really fired the imagination, and the idea of these lonely camels, the image of the camel, the romance of the Silk Road, long treks in the desert. This began to really win people over. The site Dunhuang, so this is what Dunhuang looked like in 1907 when Stein was there. It was really kind of falling apart, was not being conserved. By the 1980s, Dunhuang starts to become a tourist attraction. I went there for the first time in 1983. That's when I took this picture. And you go now, and there are lots and lots of tour groups. Last year, 2018, 9 million people visited Dunhuang. So this is like going to the Vatican. Right? And they call it the art gallery in the desert. There is a problem, of course, now with conservation the other way, because you can't have 9 million people traipsing through caves without damage to the paintings, to the murals, which are quite fragile. So there are various efforts now, international efforts underway to conserve all of that. But no mistake, the Silk Road is now one thing that many, many people will do when they go to China. They will travel the Silk Road. This has become a regular tourist destination, whereas in the early 1980s, it required a lot of effort, train, bus, to get there, and there were no hotels. Now you can rent your own camel, have your own Silk Road fantasy trip out into the desert. This is to a very early Buddhist stupa at a place called Rawak, just outside Khotan, in the southern part of the Taklamakan. Oral Stein excavated here. You can now go here yourself and have a look around. So the Silk Road really has, as I say, taken off in the popular imagination. The silk market in Kashgar, probably nothing like this existed. I don't think 1,000 or 1,500 years ago, but certainly we can buy silk there once you've gotten past the numerous security checks that you now have to get through to enter, but there it is. And then there's Yo-Yo Ma and his Silk Road journeys. Yo-Yo Ma has done a lot to popularize the idea of the Silk Road. He started something called the Silk Road Project back in 1998, and according to himself, the idea here is that this is a model for cultural collaboration, the exchange of ideas and tradition alongside commerce and innovation. You can begin to see some of the ground that has been prepared for the Belt and Road Initiative in all of this. The BRI is built upon this early infrastructure, cultural infrastructure, totally Western in origin, later with a bit of a Japanese fillip, and minimal Chinese participation really up until very recent times. So back to the academic side, what do we know now about the Silk Road? All of these sites have been opened up. There's sites in Dunhuang. There are many other texts that have been discovered in recent years, which tell us something about what really happened on the Silk Road, what life was really like in these towns that Hedin and others first unearthed. The Sogdian letters, for instance, there were 8 of these letters which Stein found in Dunhuang, written in the Sogdian script, now in the British Library. These have all been read, been translated. If you're interested in Sogdian, we teach Sogdian at Harvard. You're welcome to come and apply. Just talk to Valdemar about how to apply Droga na Harvard. Be happy to have you come. Not such a difficult language, really, Sogdian. And we know something about life on the Silk Road from these letters. We know something about it from materials that are in Chinese. These are from the Bibliothèque Nationale. Here is a bilingual, it's kind of a translation manual. This would have been your app if you were traveling on the Silk Road and you needed to move between 2 different languages, these 2 languages, Chinese and Khotanese, for the sale of a camel. This one is in St. Petersburg. Silk does show up on the Silk Road. Not a whole lot. And most of it is either in the form of the banners or in the form like this, which is money. Because silk holds its value extremely well, and it doesn't deteriorate so easily. You can keep it a long time. And it, as you can see, this silk is from over 1,000 years ago. It's in pretty good shape. So silk was used as currency on the Silk Road, it seems, at least as much, if not more often, as it was used as a gift or something that would be sold. And we have a contract, so we know silk is used as money from this contract in Chinese, for the sale of a slave girl in payment for silk. The newest research, and this has been done by scholars at Yale, Valerie Hansen, scholars in Japan, reading Tibetan texts, and in various other institutions around the world. The conclusion that they are arriving at, we could say this is a tentative conclusion, work is ongoing, but the tentative conclusion is that economic considerations were in no way primary in the opening of anything like a Silk Road. If silk was traded, it happened, but it wasn't something that the state was actively promoting. In fact, we now have an article by a Persian scholar who's based, I think, in the UK, and his title here is "The Road That Never Was: The Silk Road and Trans-Eurasian Exchange," essentially trying to bust the whole myth that there was ever any real volume of trade actively going from China all the way to the West. A lot of short distance and medium distance trade, but perhaps really very little trade going very, very far. A student of mine at Harvard a couple of years ago completed a dissertation, Kingly Exchange, Silk Road in the East Eurasian World, from 850 to 1000. Xin Wen, Professor Wen, he now teaches, he's an assistant professor at Princeton, and his argument here is that most of the goods that traveled on the Silk Road, at least according to the documents that we have, most of it was gifts. Most of it was gifts between different noble families, kings to princes, ambassadors carrying stuff back and forth, people trying to establish alliances and offering as tribute of one sort or another gifts that included silk and jade and other valuable objects. So a lot, from what we can tell, a lot of what moved on these trade routes was, in fact, not commercial in nature, but was diplomatic in nature. And we have a number of diplomats in the room, and they can tell us about the importance of gifts that they have observed in their careers. Certainly, if you've been an ambassador to China, gifts matter. They matter a lot. So that seems to have been, in fact, a lot of what moved things, and what to characterize a lot of the things that moved back and forth on the Silk Road. So this leaves us then with the question, if the historical Silk Road was not primarily about silk or even about trade so much, what was it about? What was it about? Well, I would argue, and I'll finish in just a couple of minutes, I will argue that the Silk Road, so-called, was really about diplomacy and geopolitics. That the bottom line in a lot of the movement of valuable goods on what we now call the Silk Road had to do with political motives. Which means that it has a lot to do with the Belt and Road Initiative in my reading. The Belt and Road Initiative is a signature project of President Xi Jinping. He has invested a great deal of his own prestige, the prestige of his office, a great deal of resources of his government and the people of China in building out these connections. The first Belt and Road Forum was held 2 years ago in Beijing in May. And you had many, many world leaders in attendance, including here, as you see, the president of Russia, Mr. Putin. We have, this is not something I made up for this presentation. This is Chinese TV. And this is the way that the Belt and Road Initiative is being presented to the country and to the world. That this is every political leader, or many political leaders anyhow, want to have a legacy project. This is definitely Xi Jinping's big legacy project. And it is not lacking for ambition. It's pretty amazing. When you start looking at the numbers, we'll see some of these numbers in a minute, I'm sure. It's impressive in many ways what is being committed. We have the second Belt and Road Initiative just happened in April. Again, a lot of leaders from around the world were there. Here, he is raising not a glass of baijiu, but a glass of red wine, toasting those who are present at this event. So, what I want to leave you with is this basic message. We have two images. We have horses and we have camels. And what I'd like to argue, what I'd like you to think about, is that the old Silk Road was really more about horses than it was about camels. It was more about war and politics and political alliances than it was about caravans and trade. And for whatever the rhetoric, whatever the reality of the Silk Road may be, I think that this kind of calculus between these two things remains part of what is driving the Silk Road, the New Belt and Road Initiative today. Where it will lead, I think I will leave to the speakers who are following me to help us understand better. Thank you very, very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Elliott. That was really a trip through the history, with understanding what history can bring to us when we try to understand the modern world around us. So now I would like to introduce to you Professor Matt Ferchen. Professor Matt Ferchen is a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Carnegie and Tsinghua, it wages for itself. Where he runs the China and the Developing World program. He is also a research consultant for the Leiden Asia Center, and he recently conducted the research on China's Hungary-Serbia railway project. His previous research and writing have focused on the political economy of the China model of development, as well as China's relations with Latin America. Building on this background, his current projects examine how China is managing political risk in its ties to fragile states and on the nexus of the development and security in China's foreign policy. Professor Ferchen is part of the public intellectual program sponsored by the National Committee on United States-China Relations. His work has appeared in numerous media publications such as Foreign Affairs, Caijin, The Diplomat, El País, and the Phoenix Weekly, as well as in academic publications such as a Review of International Political Economy and the Chinese Journal of International Politics. Ma, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Well, thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you also to Paulina for inviting me. We've been talking about this for quite some time. I think Mark's introduction just now was perfect setup for what I'm about to talk about, because I'm going to sort of take off on this sort of question of narratives and what the Belt and Road is all about in sort of contemporary discussions and framing of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these narratives, these sort of competing narratives that I see that have been out there in the international sphere, sort of contending for how we should understand, embrace, or reject the Belt and Road project. And I think I actually first gave a version of this presentation last year in Hungary, and I think that the tension between these narratives has only sort of picked up pace in that time. And as I'll explain, I think this has a lot to do with U.S.-China growing rivalry. And so I'm going to first talk about how I understand these frameworks. Then I'm going to dig in a little bit deeper and critique both of them a little bit, and then talk about ways forward, both in terms of research and maybe some policy implications. So in terms of takeaways, the first is simply that the Belt and Road has really, in many ways, come to stand for China's rise, and again, sort of what a lot of these narratives and the debate around it are more than about just the Belt and Road. They are about what we are to make of China and its new role in the world. And I think this has a lot to do with what Mark just described as the BRI becoming the signature project of Xi Jinping today. I think, second, that this perception battle in terms of how we understand what to make of China's rise is really at the heart of these contested narratives, and I think these narratives are quite important. And last, I think, as I'm going to point out again, that I see flaws in the narratives. I think they're politically motivated in many ways to the extent that there is an academic backing to them. It tends to be very weak. And yet, I think there are opportunities, clearly because of that weakness, for better research, but also in terms of better policy and sort of positioning oneself or one's country in sort of that framework and finding options there. So let me begin then by talking about these elements of the competing narratives, and I'll begin with what is basically the official Chinese narrative. And I want to make clear that this all was established prior to the rollout of the Belt and Road, and I actually don't consider myself a scholar or researcher of the Belt and Road per se. I often find myself sort of scratching my head saying, well, we already knew this, especially in the case of like Channel Latin America, which I do a lot of work on. So I want to emphasize that this narrative really predated the Belt and Road and many of the key facets of it in terms of the ideas and some of the realities and some of the problems behind it also predated the rollout of the Belt and Road. I think the key concept here from the Chinese point of view is this idea of peaceful development. So in 2011, China officially put in place the concept of, and in a policy paper, of peaceful development really as the core foundation of China's foreign policy. This came on the heels of the idea of China's rise, which the government in China rejected as potentially too provocative. So what we end up with is this idea of peaceful development. Now, on the one hand, this is the official narrative, and it is the propaganda, but I want to dig in a little bit because I think beyond that there is actually somewhat of a coherent, if problematic, logic, a political and economic logic to this idea of peaceful development, which is at the core of much of what's going on with the Belt and Road. So the first element of this is that China does, through this idea of peaceful development, have a core logic to its foreign policy, again, that feeds directly into the Belt and Road. And it goes like this. It posits a virtuous circle that development underpins stability, underpins development. I'm going to come back to this in a second. There is both a domestic and an international dimension to this, which I think is quite important. But what China is offering in its grandest scope to its neighbors, to those that are included in the Belt and Road, which is basically everybody now except the U.S. saying no to it, is that we are here to offer you development. China is increasingly pushing the idea on the global stage that development is important for security, and that security is also necessary for development. So for countries, for instance, in Africa, who previously needed or opportunities for development maybe weren't getting it, in part because of security challenges or stability challenges, China is increasingly packaging the Belt and Road as something that will not only contribute to development, economic development and growth, but also to stability and security. So again, a virtuous circle. It is a policy of reassurance, again, replacing this idea of China's rise or peaceful rise. Instead, it's this idea of peaceful development. And it, I think, has an element of trying to reassure the United States, not working, but is really a model of trying to say to China's neighbors and to major powers that China is not here in some sort of a warlike stance as its role in the world grows, but instead offering development, stability, development, again, in this virtuous circle. So it's a reassurance policy. I would argue that contrary to much of the way that it's been critiqued outside of China, that in many ways it is a kind of liberal, or at least kind of classic comparative advantage kind of argument. It basically says China's here on the world stage doing things for development in its own, which are in its own interests and which are in the interests of its partners. And this is certainly the case for commodity-rich developing countries, say in Africa or Latin America, and basically saying, we're here to do more trade, more investment, more financial dealings with you based on what we're good at, what you're good at, what you have, what we need, and everyone is going to prosper within this context. So in many ways, it's offered not as a statist or mercantilist kind of project, but as one in which sort of fits with what China's good at, with what others need, and it's just good for everyone. This is where we get this language of win-win, complementarity, mutual benefit. This I read as a very kind of, as an effort, again, at reassurance, and a liberal one at that, of saying, well, we're not here to use statist methods, we're just here to do what's in our interest, what's in your interest, we all benefit. I think that this logic, the circular, the idea that there is a virtuous circle is something that's deeply embedded also in China's domestic political economy. Again, going back at least to the 1980s, Deng offered the idea that there needed to be a combination of development opportunities, but that was going to require a kind of stability that didn't exist in the pre-Deng years, and that then you would have, again, an opportunity for more economic growth, for people's lives to improve, but there had to be political, economic, social stability for that. Again, a virtuous circle offered by the Communist Party to the people of China. This is also, I think, what's being offered on the global stage. We see a version of this, and it's a sort of self-contained political, economic logic of governance that the Chinese Communist Party has used domestically for quite some time, that it's very comfortable with, and that it's offering on the global stage. And the concrete instantiation of this is infrastructure. China has built up massive amounts of infrastructure which stand in for development domestically. Here it is now offering the world infrastructure and saying, here is development for you. We're good at it. We'll finance it. We'll build it. You need it. It's going to help everyone out. Again, sort of a closed circle. So let me leave it at that for a minute and let's talk about the critique of it. If that is a sort of win-win approach, and we hear this ad nauseum from the Chinese side, win-win, mutually beneficial, it is a central part of this logic. The opposite of this is one which says China is playing a zero-sum mercantilist game. If the first peaceful development logic is clearly Chinese government policy and propaganda, this is a little bit more hard to pin down, this counter-narrative of saying that China is playing a mercantilist game in which it's zero-sum and China is offering these commercial deals but really trying to gain power through them. This was a little bit more nebulous. However, now there are a number of people in the Trump administration in the United States and in some think tanks and elsewhere, a few in academia, at least in the United States. I think we see a little bit of it in parts of Europe as well, who are using this kind of pushback. Let me go into some of the details. So this is basically the idea of saying, don't buy China's win-win rhetoric. The Belt and Road is a geopolitical Trojan horse. It is offering these commercial deals, but it really is attempting to solidify and to increase its influence. The term geoeconomics has kind of come out of nowhere. Basically, within the field of political science, within the field of international political economy in the West, this idea of geoeconomics, which now has quite a bit of traction, including Carnegie even has a new geoeconomics field, a new substream. This has basically come out of nowhere to more or less identify this idea that there is an important new element of geopolitics on the world stage, and it's captured by what China is doing through the Belt and Road. So this idea of geoeconomics, that China's out doing these connectivity infrastructure projects on the global stage, trying to increase its clout. often through those who are too naive to understand. And this is basically the pushback from the U.S. State Department under both Tillerson and Pompeo have been out talking to Latin American audiences, to African audiences, basically saying, watch out, China is telling you one thing, it is doing quite another. The idea that China is telling others that it is a win-win scenario, but in fact, China is basically sort of winning twice. China has a long-term strategy in place, and that it will benefit China primarily. And we see this sort of at its extreme in the language of debt trap diplomacy. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but this captures this idea that China is offering infrastructure, finance for infrastructure, which again on the Chinese side is saying, we're here to help you, this is development, this is good for everyone. The pushback is to say, no, it's not, you're being duped, you're naive, you're going to end up in this trap where China gets economic and political leverage over you when the deals go wrong, deals which China knew would go wrong, or at least that's the implication. Let me talk a little bit then about some of the flaws in these narratives. Again, as you can see, these are really kind of diametrically opposed, win-win, zero-sum. The idea that these are developmental and almost the opposite. They're anti-developmental. They're going to harm you developmentally. So we really see extreme positions along these lines. But let me dig in a little bit on some of the ways in which these are at best incomplete. So on the peaceful development win-win side of things, one of them, again, especially when you look at different parts of the world, it doesn't capture a lot of what China had been doing, at least prior to the Belt and Road, especially in the developing world. As I mentioned, at least China's relations with places like Latin America, that's pretty much straightforward comparative advantage. South America is commodity rich. What is flowing from South America to China? It tends to be minerals and energy and agricultural products. So there are, again, depending on where you look, a lot of the flow of things tends to actually be based on more kind of classic comparative advantage kinds of things. But I think that China overplayed its hand in thinking that it could take that kind of a relationship and put it into place with the Belt and Road and expect that all good things would flow from these newly created kinds of relationships which it had in terms of trade, investment, and finance with especially developing countries, which is where I think the Belt and Road really focuses. And in fact, this idea that the sort of commercial takeoff in relations with regions like Latin America, like Africa, like parts of Central Asia, would then lead to all positive outcomes on the political side. I think there was a little bit of delusion on the Chinese side and a little bit of belief that you could really, truly buy friends or buy influence. The other side of this is that China is faced with a dilemma, which is that it uses a fair number of statist, if not mercantilist, kinds of practices on the global stage. It uses state-owned enterprises. It uses state-owned banks for much of at least the Belt and Road kinds of projects. They are key to these. So it is hard then for the government to distance itself and say, well, if this is just a good project, that's what another country needs for infrastructure. Well, if it's being done by state-owned organizations, state-owned enterprises, and state-owned banks, it makes it much more hard for the host countries or other critics to basically say, well, so this is just purely a commercial operation. So that reality is there. There are assumptions on the Chinese side that it knows what development is based on its own experience, and the idea that more infrastructure is going to be what others need and everyone's going to be happy with it and that is going to count as development runs into a lot of difficult realities in other developing countries, especially where ideas about what development is, what it should be, how it should be done, what the relationship maybe is between development and stability. A lot of the problems that we have heard about in terms of some of the deals through the Belt and Road, the kinds of things that are being labeled as debt trap diplomacy really touch on some of these questions of what China believes is a good development project versus what some of the host countries believe. And lastly, in terms of this peaceful development framework, China, I believe, really ran with what they believed were some of the lessons from their engagement with regions like Latin America and Africa and decided that those would work really well in other regions as well, including, I think, Southeast Asia. They continue to use this logic of win-win complementarity, of areas of common development, where there are true security concerns as well. So they use this logic in regions where it is much harder to roll out. So, I think we see some of this pushback and some of the critique of it in this geoeconomic kind of framework touches on at least some of these, but not all of these issues. Let me then talk about what's wrong with some of the geoeconomics pushback. It's deeply political. You will see that those who are using it now, in particular, are making political hay with that argument, even if the basis for it is not very well developed. So a number of politicians in the United States, Marco Rubio, among others, is using this kind of a logic to say, look, China was mercantilist from the beginning. I know it. I see it. Let's worry about it and push back against China. It has become a central feature in the new kind of strategic standoff and pushback between the United States and China. So it's political. It's based on something that I sort of blame Kissinger for, this idea that China is all-knowing and all-powerful and playing a game of three-dimensional or four-dimensional or whatever kind of geopolitics that those in the West simply do not understand. So the idea that Xi Jinping himself is behind this thing, a lot of people are saying, well, but China has a plan. It's a global plan. It's the Belt and Road. It's all this money. It's in all these places. They must be able to connect the dots. It must be part of a longer-term strategy. And some of the Trump administration's key advisors have played into this directly. And they say we understand that China is using its economic power now in a way that it was basically, people were naive about it in the past. We now understand the true basis of this. Again, this is really factored into this narrative and pushback. But this leaves out much of the messiness of not just China's diplomacy over time, but the way things work domestically. This narrative I said, where China said it's about development, stability, development. Well, how messy was that for the last 40 plus years? Who got to decide what was development? Is it okay to ruin the environment? Well, it was at one point sort of acceptable politically. It is no longer the case, right? So what is acceptable development? This actually was a key topic in the Hu Jintao administration. So it's not obvious what that is, or that when the government says, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, that they're actually able to do it. Yet much of the knowledge of sort of how messy that process was, but also how adaptable China was, really has not been applied to this global critique. So we see almost the way in which, for instance, the Sri Lanka debt trap narrative has evolved is that, China must have planned this. But very few say, well, what if there were motives on all sides? What if there were misunderstandings? What if it was a bad project from the beginning, and yet everyone piled on, and what we have here is an unexpected outcome? I work a lot on China-Venezuela. This is the story of China-Venezuela. Everybody from the start had political motives, and they miscalculated, and it's now a big mess. So that does not fit at all with this sort of geoeconomic strategy. Again, a kind of messy process whereby the implementation of these things does not line up with the plan. And lastly, it sort of takes away any kind of agency from host countries who are coming up with many of the projects for the Belt and Road. Again, some of those projects have been ill-conceived, and I would say that's really where the problems begin with some of these things. But there's a huge range that we see in terms of host governments and what kinds of projects they propose, how well vetted they are, how inclusive they are in terms of thinking about, say, for instance, local communities where you're going to build a dam or a railway or something. So there is a lot more going on here than I think this geoeconomics approach appreciates. Let me make a few concluding remarks then about sort of what all of this means. First of all, I would say expect more, not less, of this kind of battle of narratives. I think it is central to what's going on right now in the U.S.-China relationship and the way that the United States under this administration has chosen to push back on China. I would say it'll probably get more extreme as this debt or as this trade negotiations go on, but I don't think it's going to go away. These are about efforts to portray what China means to its own people and to the world, and therefore also sort of what it means to, say, U.S. leadership. And I think there are discussions in the EU about this as well. That said, I think that the fact that these narratives are sort of extreme and that they're flawed in a variety of ways, it means there's a lot of room for better research, and a lot of it in this sort of area of geoeconomics. Well, what does economic power mean? You know, the United States became the largest economy in the world in the late 1800s. It did not become the most influential country in the world, at least not in the way it has managed to become so in terms of economic and security clout until after World War II. So we see this gap. Like, just to say that China is richer, how come we assume then that that means power or influence? A lot of what China is running into, even its own neighborhood, are the limits on how much its larger economic size and importance will actually allow it to get its way in other places. So there's a lot of room for better understanding of these things. What does it mean to have economic power? Where does China actually have influence or not through the Belt and Road and other kinds of engagement, commercial engagement? Another element that I think is positive in this, to a certain extent, is it's a kind of Sputnik moment. And I see this in the U.S., maybe less than in Europe. But all around the world, there's China. People are saying to themselves, well, China's here. Maybe it's a competitive threat. Maybe we have security concerns. But what does that mean for how we organize ourselves? A lot of this comes back to issues like questions of industrial planning. If China is good at X, Y, and Z, and technology and a number of other things, then what should we do as a country, or what should the EU do as an organization to try to protect itself but also become competitive? So there is a kind of spur to motivation. We can see this in the BRI in particular. I think that discussion is a healthier one and more advanced in some ways in Europe than it is in the United States. And lastly, I would say, and this is something I learned doing this project last year, looking at the Chinese-backed railway in Hungary and Serbia, is that countries like Poland and others are not in this alone. There are countries, every country around the world that is part of this Belt and Road project, but every country that is engaging with China, which is increasingly interdependent with China, is asking, how do we understand this place? How do we understand what its companies are, its banks are? How do we understand its strategies? So there is a lot of opportunity for mutual understanding, both, I think, in terms of other countries who are trying to deal with these very same issues. And I'm sure we're going to hear more about this in the legal dimension very shortly. So that on that positive note, that there might be opportunities for learning, both in academic sense and also in policy senses, I will leave it at that. Thank you.